Okay, so thanks for having me, Hal. It's a pleasure. I haven't actually visited the Google campus here before, though I've been to the one in New York many times. Today's talk is called The Dimensions of Reputation in Electronic Markets. Most of my research is actually theory, applied economic theory. That's sort of like the bulk of my published work. But recently, I've been dabbling with, there's so much interesting data that is being generated as a byproduct of electronic commerce. So I've been dabbling with data recently, and I'm fortunate to have two wonderful co-authors on this paper, Anindya Ghosh and Panos Iporotis, both junior colleagues of mine, both of whom actually last year were awarded NSF Career Awards on their first try. So I'm reaping some of the benefits of sort of smart hiring decisions that we've made over the last few years. So what's the motivation for this sort of, I'm going to spend 5 minutes sort of telling you about the sort of the broader research program here, and then sort of delve into the details of the specific case study, which is reputation systems. The motivation here is that there's an increasingly large amount of user-generated content, as all of you know. And it's being generated frequently in a commercial context. As a consequence, it's our conjecture, and this is a fairly reasonable one, that this user-generated content is having sort of an economic or business impact. So for instance, if you go to an online retailer, you read a bunch of reviews of a product, your purchasing decision is influenced by the content in those reviews. And so there is an economic impact of this user-generated content. So it seems like something that businesses should be paying attention to. That little picture down there, which I stole from the Wall Street Journal, is just simply to sort of highlight the fact that we've had product reviews and we've had feedback on sellers and for a while now. But the volume of user-generated content has sort of like, the interaction between consumers and websites goes from being sort of transaction and one-way feedback to more of a conversation as more people, as more employees create blogs, as more companies sort of encourage the creation of wikis that are product-related or commercial. The amount of user-generated content that we're going to be seeing as having economic impact is increasing. Now, unfortunately, this content doesn't sort of come neatly packaged in a way that makes it amenable to immediate analysis. It's not completely unstructured. I mean, we do have language, and there is sort of a certain structure associated with the sentences and content, but it's only semi-structured. Most of it that we've been interested in is in the form of text, but not exclusively so. One might think of recordings of customer service telephone calls as also being a form of user-generated content that has information in it that might, for instance, be relevant to product design. So the purpose of this sort of broader program of research is to quantify this information that is contained in user-generated content and see if one can associate this information with sort of some sort of measurable economic impact. So what do you need in order to do this? I mean, first of all, you need to pick a context in which the content is actually likely to make a difference. So one might, for instance, today, take a look at sort of news groups around the web, look for references to Halo 3, and try and associate that with the earnings of the companies associated with the email addresses of the people who are making these postings. With the conjecture that people who are talking about Halo 3 today are probably not being very productive. Maybe this will sort of have this Halo 3 effect. I saw this when Halo 2 came out in terms of not just attendance in my class, but in terms of general productivity. But there are some contexts in which the impact is higher than others. So when the information contained in this content is something that is not easily available elsewhere, that's when the content is likely to have a sort of significant economic impact. And let me illustrate this with an example. Suppose you're buying a flat screen television. You might go onto ePinions or Amazon or some other sort of site that is a repository of product reviews and read what other users have said about the different flat panel televisions that you were planning to buy. But most people that I've talked to also go to sort of more specialized publications. They go deep into sort of the product specs that are well-defined specifications that influence what people think the quality of these flat panel televisions are. So there are sort of substitutes for these product reviews elsewhere that are not sort of necessarily generated by consumers. On the other hand, take children's toys. The specs associated with most children's toys are not really very informative. What you really want to know is your kid going to play with this and enjoy it and sort of not throw it into a corner in 2 days? So in that context, reading sort of user experiences from other parents about these toys has sort of experiential information that you can't generally get from other sources. And so contexts in which there's sort of experiential information contained in the user-generated content seem to be contexts in which the economic impact is likely to be the most salient. You also need a measurable economic variable. You need something that you're trying to quantify what you mean by economic impact. It could be the price charged by the manufacturer of a product. It could be the price charged by a retailer over and above their competitors, as will be in today's study. It could be demand. It could be changes in demand. It could be costs in the context of looking at customer service feedback and some manufacturing costs. You might be looking at customer satisfaction. You might be scouring employee blogs and trying to associate them with productivity. But you need a measurable economic variable. And then you need a way of converting this semi-structured content into a set of variables that can be associated with the economic variable. And what we've done is used sort of a variety of text mining techniques for sort of taking the text that we have and structuring it. However, in doing so, it also sort of made us realize that you need methods for aggregating the structured, these variables in a way that is meaningful to the business context. And I'll talk about this a little more in a little while, sort of leave it abstract for the time being. Then finally, you need a way of associating this aggregated structured content with the measurable economic variable. The structure, the information contained in the product reviews with, say, the price of the product or the change in demand of the product. So today's case study is on reputation feedback from a specific online retailer and how that affects the pricing power of competing sellers. Sort of a disclaimer before I go on. The results that I'm going to present, just to sort of set your expectations, there aren't going to be these things that jump out at you and make you say, aha, I didn't realize that this dimension of reputation really mattered. What I want you to sort of take away from the talk today, it has more to do with, here's how you'd approach thinking about quantifying user-generated content that is created in a commercial context and associating it with a particular economic outcome. And I'm using our study on reputation feedback at this online retailer as a way of sort of showcasing how you might go about thinking about and analyzing something like this. All right, so why is reputation feedback interesting? And why do we think that user-generated content might be influential in this context? Well, we've sort of been grappling with this puzzle for many years now that despite sort of the ability of consumers to actually buy from any online retailer that they want and price compare, there is still sustained price dispersion. Identical products sold by competing sellers are listed at different prices and are sold at different prices. So here's an example of a product that I know you all love. I thought I'd use it as an example because, I don't know for how many years we'll be able to use this as an example of a commercial product anymore. And so there's sort of a feeling of nostalgia that I'm getting whenever I look at that box. But here are 3 sellers. Now, these are sellers who are listing this product on Amazon's retailing platform. So there's no real difference in terms of and they're listed one next to the other. If someone clicked on this, Amazon would handle the payment, and then this retailer would be responsible for delivering. So if I told you that, okay, let's get rid of that picture. If I told you that Amazon made the sale with this listing, you wouldn't be surprised, right? Because if you think about it, they have a $44 sort of, their price is $44 lower than Midway. It's about $53 if you include shipping, lower than Ant Online. And so there's no real premium that Amazon is charging, like, based on the data that you have over here. But this isn't the whole story. On the same page, there are also two other sellers listed. There's JNR selling it for $62 less than Amazon. There's Tiger Direct selling it for $11 less than Amazon. However, Amazon still manages to sell this product at the price that they're charging frequently. So those differences that I've highlighted up there are what I'm going to be calling price premiums in what follows. So Amazon has a price premium of $10.99 over Tiger Direct and $62 over JNR, and a negative price premium over the other two. So you might conclude, okay, this is probably an isolated case. I mean, this is Amazon's platform, this is Amazon's price. Maybe people aren't seeing this page, maybe they're just going and clicking on it. That's not really the case. In the data that we've gathered, which relate to the sale of 280 different software titles over a 6-month period, what I'm showing you here is the distribution of this measured price premium. So we take each successfully completed transaction, and we look at the difference between the price of the seller who made the sale and the price of the other sellers listed who were selling an identical product, who were listed on the same page, and who had that product available at the time the seller made the sale. So let me repeat that. It's at the time a seller made a sale on Amazon's platform. What is the difference between the price the successful seller was charging and the price that the other sellers, who the consumer could have bought from, had listed for an identical product? And this is software. And so we don't have to worry about things like condition of book and so on. I mean, software is software. That's why we chose it sort of as our first context. So it's sort of puzzling, right? I mean, what's going on here? Why are these consumers paying so many more dollars to the seller that they successfully, that they buy from, when in fact a set of competing alternatives at a lower price exist? Yes, you had a question?
So your last slide would produce 4 data points in this chart?
Yes, exactly. The question was whether the last slide that I showed would produce 4 data points, and yes, it would. So M data points, 1 for each competing seller at the time a transaction is successfully completed.
How do you know a transaction was completed?
We have a way of sort of mining the XML feed that they give us to infer when a listing disappears. But I'll actually spend 5 minutes, sort of somewhere in the middle of the talk, getting into the details of that if I have time. So one might wonder, I mean, what are these consumers paying for? I mean, consumers are rational to some extent. They're being presented with a set of competing alternatives for an identical product on the same retailing platform. There's got to be something that they're paying for over and above that they're paying these sellers a premium for.
One could even ask why they didn't buy the one on the extreme left. I mean, the red rectangle around everything except the extreme left.
Well, not really, because these are cases in which the seller who successfully sold the product had a higher price than one or more of his competitors. Over here, it wouldn't be that surprising because it would just mean that my price was lower.
You just said that over there, it would mean that he had a higher price than some of his.
Yes.
But in the 4 points from the last chart would produce points over there that weren't sales.
Well, no, if Amazon made the sale, then there would be 2 points produced that would be on the left, where Amazon had a lower price, and 2 points produced, which would be on the right, where Amazon had a higher price than a competitor, but still successfully transacted. Okay?
Do you consider the position of where the product is listed?
Okay, the question is, do we consider the position of the product? No, we don't actually. There's sort of an implicit assumption here that if someone is considering a product, that they would have actually sort of scrolled down and looked at all the competing alternatives. Although I do believe that these products are generally listed. There's sometimes a featured seller, but these products are generally listed in ascending order of price. So sort of makes it even more surprising because the lowest price guy is going to be on top. All right, so our conjecture here is that when you transact online, you buy more than a product.
Get it back up in a second.
Okay. What you're actually paying for is not just the product itself, but a set of what we call fulfillment characteristics. So the things that we take for granted when we buy stuff in the real world. You go to Best Buy, I'm thinking of buying a flat panel television, so this is sort of like, on my mind as the standard example. You go, you look at it, and then when you actually transact, you pick it up and you have the product with you. It's in its box. So there are a few things that you've sort of taken for granted in this transaction as compared to transacting online, right? You don't know when the product is going to arrive. You don't know if the product that is going to be sent to you by the seller is actually going to be the one that you ordered. If you have a problem, you don't know if they're going to take it back. And so there are all these sort of dimensions of fulfillment that used to be sort of obvious when you transacted in a face-to-face setting, which have to somehow be inferred when you're transacting online. And it's been recognized for a while that reputation systems play a role here. They provide consumers with information about these unobserved characteristics. However, what sort of the prior literature has ignored is that, there are many different characteristics. I mean, I might care about getting the product as soon as possible. Someone else might care about, has it been packaged well? Someone else might care about, if I change my mind and want to change my order, how responsive is the seller to my needs? Someone else might just say, if I call these guys, I want them to be polite. I want an email acknowledging the fact that I've placed my order. I mean, consumers are different. They're heterogeneous. Different consumers value different things. And different sellers have varying abilities on these characteristics. Some of them might compete on delivery. Some of them might compete on, sending it the day it's ordered in every case. I actually sort of went onto the site and became a retailer for a period of 3 months. I sold used books, just to sort of get a sense for what it, and it's relatively straightforward to sort of build up a reputation here. And different people do care about different things. So we think that the fact that, nobody has recognized as yet that reputation, or that sellers are multidimensional in terms of the information that's contained in their reputation profiles, and buyers are heterogeneous, is one of the reasons why there's been sort of an array of evidence all over the place about does reputation matter. Some people say that positive feedback matters, negative doesn't. Others say that we can't find any evidence that positive matters, but negative comments are the ones that really matter. These studies are generally conducted using data from eBay, which sort of makes the outcomes sort of susceptible to the usual problems associated with variables that are determined using an auction. And the measure of reputation tends to be fairly one-dimensional. There's either a numerical score, maybe there's sort of how many transactions, but it's sort of taking something that is capturing a fairly rich, multidimensional characteristic of a seller and reducing it to a number between 0 and 5. So if you look at this reputation profile, you'll see that, yes, there are numbers associated with it. How many times has the seller transacted, and what's their average rating, and how many times they've transacted. But there's a ton of other information as well. And every time someone posts feedback and gives them a score, they also post text. And there's a lot of information about the seller in this text. So if you think about what I said about economic impact, it's reasonable to conjecture that consumers are reading these things and making their purchasing decisions based on the information that is contained in this text. If that is the case, then the price that these consumers pay to the successful sellers should be associated in some way with the information that's in this reputation feedback. And that's what we do in this study. We sort of structure it and try and associate, try and find, like, what kind of feedback leads to, like, what level of pricing power. So here are our questions. We're interested in identifying the different dimensions of online reputation. That is, what are the characteristics that buyers are talking about when they post feedback about sellers? What do they care about? And can we quantify these different dimensions? So can you actually measure the direction of, like, having, because the content, the textual content that is provided here, it's not as if the buyer is given a set of dimensions and asked to score them on 1 to 5. They're just sort of like, typing feedback, right? And so we want to be able to sort of evaluate the strength and the direction of each individual evaluation. So how much better is it for someone to have good service rather than okay service? Is okay service positive? It may well be negative, given these sort of, like, superlatives that are generally used in user feedback of this kind. Is super fast delivery faster than excellent delivery? Is good packaging a positive evaluation? And is there a simple way of aggregating, these dimension modifier pairs into topics that have sort of a meaningful business context? And I'll spend a couple of minutes on this towards the end of the talk. And then, like, the second part, so this is sort of explanatory. How do we quantify, looking at outcomes that have already occurred, and looking at the price premiums that successful sellers have been charging. To what extent can we quantify how can we associate these price premiums with the information contained in the textual feedback appropriately structured? The second bit has to do with predictive modeling, and can you actually use the information contained in these reputation profiles to predict, given a set of competing sellers, who's going to make the sale? And if you can do that, can you convert this, and maybe this would sort of be of special interest to your company, can you convert this into some sort of product for sellers, where you tell a seller, well, here's the feedback that your consumers have given you. Can you guys in the back hear me? All right, where you tell a seller, this is what your consumers have said about you. Tell me who your competitors are. Let me look at the price that you're charging now. And is there a way that I can actually, I see the volume has gone up. Is there a way that guidance can be provided to a seller in the following way, saying that, well, here's what your consumers have said about you. Show me the sort of, like, here are the people who are competing with you. The price that you're charging is too low. You can charge more and you'll still have a good probability of making the sale. So we've actually sort of developed a prototype of a tool that can do this for sellers on Amazon. One could potentially think of converting this into a tool for buyers. One might think of converting this into part of a marketplace infrastructure so as to increase the efficiency of transactions. All right, so that's sort of the research agenda. Can we explain price premiums? Can we use it to predict? Yeah?
Wouldn't you need to model the buyers as well? I mean, you just got through saying that buyers are different.
Yes. We would, and sort of the model that underlies our data analysis does recognize that buyers are different.
Okay.
We don't actually have any information about how these buyers are different, and so, the model isn't identified, and we can't disentangle what. But I do have one result that sort of provides evidence that buyers are heterogeneous in a particular way, but you're right. All right, so what's the data that we're using? I'm sort of skipping the part about the model and just sort of going into the data and the equations that we estimate. And so we tracked the transactions associated with a sort of randomly selected sample of 280 software products across 5 different categories. What we did is we gathered data on all the secondary market transactions. That is, this is from Amazon. When a product is listed, in addition to Amazon actually listing its own offer, there's a bunch of people who sort of conduct commerce using Amazon's platform. So that's what we're calling the secondary market, even though all of these products are typically new. We have the complete reputation profiles for all of the sellers who completed 1 or more transactions during the 6-month period. So in our sample, there was a total of a little over 1,000 sellers. About 12% of them actually successfully completed a transaction on the 280 products that we're tracking. So they may have completed other transactions on, you might think, okay, so what are they doing there if only? And so this leads to about 108,000 observations. And to sort of go back to a question that was asked, yes, an observation consists of a transaction. For each transaction, if there are M competitors, then there are M observations generated, each one consisting of the differences in the reputation of the seller and the competitor, and the differences in the price charged by the seller who succeeded and the competitor who didn't. All right, this is just to sort of refresh your memory about the fact that, so this would, if Amazon sold the product here, this would generate 4 observations. To go back to Hal's question about how do we infer whether a sale has occurred or not, this is a snapshot of the kind of data that, we start with, where you have a unique identifier for each seller. You have a timestamp associated with the fact that the listing exists. There is a unique identifier associated with a particular product. And so Microsoft Windows Vista would have a particular identifier. A particular book would have a particular identifier. And there's an identifier associated with a particular listing. And this is sort of important. So if a seller lists a particular item, the item is sold, and then the seller says, okay, I've got 1 more of these. Let me list it again. You'd have the same seller ID, you'd have the same item ID, but the listing ID would be different, even if it was the same seller selling the same product. And so once a product is sold, the next time we get the feed, that listing no longer exists. Yes?
As I'm listening to this, I'm introspecting on my own behavior as a purchaser. And one of the things that I noticed that I'm wondering if you can capture here is that I'm much more likely to pay a premium in order to deal with somebody that I've dealt with before, rather than deal with someone for whom all of the external signals might be just as good or better, and whose price might be lower, but simply if the premium is small, and I'll prefer to be sticky. Do you have customer identity over transactions so you can measure stickiness?
Okay, so the question had to do with can we take into account the fact that buyers sometimes like to buy from sellers who they have transacted with before because they have sort of gained information from personal experience. In this particular study, no. It's a good point. It's one that we've thought about. We can infer which buyer posted, made a posting about each seller. But given the data that we have, we cannot associate a particular buyer with each of these transactions. And so that's something where it's a reasonable conjecture, I think, that it actually would sort of pan out as part of a sort of model of behavior of consumers. But in order to actually sort of establish the extent to which this matters, we would sort of need data at a sort of higher granularity than we have available right now. Okay, so if you take this example, we've got a feed on a particular day. then we get the feed sort of on the next day, or these are sort of at 8-hour intervals. If the listing still exists for a particular listing, then we know that the item is still available. If, on the other hand, the listing has disappeared, we conclude that the item has been sold. It could be that this, I think every 60 days these items are automatically delisted, so there is a little bit of noise in this data. We sort of check to see if, it happened to correspond to a listing that was exactly 60 days old, in which case we drop it from our data. But we're sort of making the leap of faith here that this corresponds to a transaction rather than the seller just sort of delisting it, because there aren't too many reasons why you'd think a seller would delist a product because they've already paid the fee to list it. Okay, so that's how we sort of make inferences about what transactions have occurred. And every time we notice one of these transactions, what we do is we look at the competitive profile, or let's say the competitive sort of landscape for that particular seller, and we create these different observations. Okay, so we look at the entire reputation profile of that, but we capture the identity of these competing sellers. We sort of record the time at which this occurred so that we can capture their reputation at the point in time that the transaction occurred. And we sort of keep track of that for each of the competing sellers at the time that the sale occurred. So we've sort of measured the premium, the pricing power of sellers in two different ways. One is in the way that I've just been talking about, where there are for every seller-competitor pair, there's an observation generated. We also sort of looked at a different measure, which is just sort of take the average of the competitor prices and take the difference between that and the seller's price. So we get one observation per transaction. So on average, how much more can a seller charge than its competitors? So that's the distribution of seller-competitor pair price premiums, the one that I showed you on an earlier slide, where we're sort of our hypothesis is that all of this pricing power that is contained in the right side of the distribution is on account of sellers having a better reputation, and this reputation being something that buyers are willing to pay for. Slightly flatter distribution for average, not surprisingly. So you've got, but there's still this. What's interesting about this is that it's not just sort of it peaks near zero, slightly below zero, which is not surprising, but there's a fairly large sort of probability mass all the way down to it doesn't sort of just peter off. So there's clearly something going on here. All right, the other variables that we have, since we know that this is not the only thing that is influencing a seller's success or not, we've got the price of the product. Maybe reputation matters more for more expensive products. Maybe it doesn't. And we've got all the numerical information that prior studies have. Maybe there are some people who do only look at the numbers and don't read the text, so we've got that information. Maybe there are some buyers who only care about how long the seller has been transacting and not really about their rating, and so or place a higher premium on people who have been around longer, sort of inferring that they're more reliable. So we've got that variable as well. And maybe the pricing power of a seller is affected negatively by the number of competitors that they have. If at some point there are only 3 people who have listed a product, maybe you're going to charge a higher price. If there are 14 people, maybe you're going to charge a lower price. So we've sort of controlled for that as well. Now, how do we decompose the reputation profile? So our underlying model is that every seller is characterized by a set of fulfillment characteristics. And we model each characteristic as a dimension represented by some particular noun or verb phrase. Shipping, for instance, would be a dimension. Packaging would be a dimension. Delivery would be a dimension. Responsiveness would be a dimension. Politeness would be a dimension. Service would be a dimension. And for each of these sellers, we sort of mine their text to discover these dimensions. So if you take the example that I showed you earlier, you sort of let loose one of these syntactic parsers on the text that is contained in the reputation profile, and it goes in and sort of identifies the different dimensions. And then the same sort of program then sort of associates particular modifiers with these dimensions. So when someone is commenting on shipping, it could be fast shipping. And that's sort of like, that's fairly clear what the polarity of that sort of modification of shipping is. Same with great packaging and terrible service. But what about phenomenal unresponsiveness? You might conclude that this is clearly not a positive assessment. And I guess that sort of strikes at the heart of why our method is sort of different, because how valuable or not valuable phenomenal unresponsiveness is going to be in the text is going to actually be driven by whether or not this leads to a positive or negative price premium. And this could, unbelievable price, I'm not quite sure whether that's positive or negative. It could be positive, but it could be negative as well. Though, of course, if it's negative, then one might wonder why the buyer sort of transacted with that seller at all. But anyway, the main point here is that these dimensions are not modified by scores. They're modified by words. And sometimes the polarity of these words can depend on the dimension that they're modifying. All right, so this is how the text retrieval algorithm works. We get all the feedback postings associated with seller. We use a tagger, and the actual programs that we're using here are sort of standard open source stuff. We haven't sort of actually, the innovation here is not in a new method for actually mining the text. This is also, one of my co-authors, Panos, is sort of a text mining expert, and so this is sort of fairly standard, here's how you structure the stuff. So we end up with 151 unique dimensions and a sort of pool of 142 modifiers that are associated with them. Clearly, not every dimension has all 142 modifiers associated with it, but there's some overlap. So what we do is we take this sort of like unstructured text, and it ends up being this matrix. You can think of every posting as having a particular. Let me give you an example actually. So suppose the feedback was I was impressed by the speedy delivery, great service. We'd end up with 2 dimensions, service and delivery, and 2 modifiers associated with those dimensions, speedy and great. And then we sort of discover all these dimensions, and so there's sort of one column of the matrix associated with each dimension. And then the corresponding modifier is scores, or modifies that particular dimension. And so our postings are structured in the following way. Now, we're still in sort of the realm of words, right? Phenomenal unresponsiveness, great service. So what we're, sort of the model of behavior we have here is that, one, it accounts for the fact that older reputation postings are less likely to have been read by a buyer than newer ones. So there's sort of a damping factor that we apply to older postings relative to new, depending on, there are 25 listed per page. And so there's a particular factor associated with clicking from one page to the next page that, we take into account the fact that a buyer might have different weights placed on each of these different dimensions, though we don't have data about what these weights are for specific buyers. And so what we estimate will sort of end up being a mixture of the true score associated with having a particular word modify a particular dimension and the weights themselves. And so given a set of scores associated with a particular dimension modifier pair and a set of weights associated with a particular buyer, what this captures is the premium that that buyer is willing to pay a seller. So, and again, just to sort of highlight this, what we're doing here is we're using these price premiums as being completely determined by our control variables and the reputation as embodied in the text. And so the scores that we're going to estimate now, which will account for what were the quantitative variables and lifetime, numerical rating, and so on. And so there's one variable there's one independent variable associated with each dimension modifier pair. And eventually, the coefficient of that variable gives you a sense for how important is that dimension modifier pair. And the sign of that coefficient is an estimate of, is the polarity of this modifier for this particular dimension positive or negative? So we're not going to some sort of word bank or deciding that some words are positive and some words are negative. It's the economic value of having these in your feedback that is actually driving how we score these, the modification of a particular dimension. So here are some estimates. What I want you to take away from this particular picture, and as I said, so the regressions that we've run are very simple. We just modify our data in a way that makes the distributions well behaved, and it's ordinary least squares. We do control for unobserved heterogeneity. So that might partially account for some of this repeat. A buyer might be buying from a particular seller. Maybe a seller has, other aspects to them that are not contained in this. So this particular table has product, seller, and competitor fixed effects. And the dependent variable has to do with our basic price premium, not the average. Now, what this, I guess there are two things that I want you to take away from these particular coefficients. The signs of these things are as expected. This is a variable that captures the difference between the numerical rating of the seller who successfully transacted and the numerical rating of their competitor. So having a higher rating than your competitors leads to a higher price premium. Having transacted longer leads to a higher price premium. And the more competitors that you're competing with at any point in time, the lower the price premium that you're charging. Okay, all fairly intuitive. Do the same thing, but in the equation that we estimate, whose coefficients are listed on the right of this slide, we also include the dimension modifier pairs, one variable for each dimension modifier pair. And two things happen. First of all, the extent to which these numerical ratings explain variations in price premium goes down, and the magnitude drops. And the explanatory power of the model goes up. And so both of these are positive signs. Both of them are consistent with the theory that people are actually reading this user-generated content and making decisions based on it. I don't have a good way, so I'm committing the cardinal sin of the speaker who puts up a big table of numbers and doesn't have a good way for you to get your heads around them. The signs of these coefficients are meaningful. So positive coefficient corresponds to having determined that a particular dimension modifier pair, evidence that that has a positive impact on the price that a seller can charge. So excellent communication is good, best seller is good, friendly service is good, great merchant is good. I'd hesitate to compare the magnitudes of these across because the ranges of the variable values are different. So what we've done here is that the variable contains the score of the seller on a particular dimension modifier pair. And then we take the difference of that score and the corresponding score of the competing seller who did not make the sale, which is why some of these have negative means. And so some things appear more frequently, some phrases appear more frequently than others, and so it's hard to sort of make a meaningful, from this table, make a meaningful sort of quantitative comparison between the magnitudes of these. Here are some things that you don't want to have in your text feedback. Wrong address, never responded, bad experience, defective product, all consistently, significantly, negatively affecting the premium that you can charge. And so sort of like, in order to actually make meaningful comparisons, we sort of went through this exercise of saying, well, how do we transform this, account for the fact that these variables have different ranges, and associate a dollar value with having a particular phrase, dimension modifier pair, in the feedback that your buyers are posting for you. So what you'd interpret these as is if a particular seller had wonderful experience in every one of their feedback postings, then sort of the estimation that we've done would suggest that this seller can charge, on average, a premium of $5.86 over its competitors. And that may not seem like a very large sum, but these are software titles that cost anywhere from tens of dollars to a couple $100. So this is like an extremely significant amount in terms of relative to the average margin that you might expect a seller in this marketplace to be making. I mean, whenever I look at this table, I'm sort of end up playing this word association game where I try to combine, try to construct phrases that might have the positive dimension modifier pair and a negative dimension modifier pair. It reminds me of sort of a party game that we used to play. So for instance, lightning delivery and a horrible experience. So there was perfect packaging, but it wasn't as advertised. Anyway, what I want you to take away from the slide is that there are potentially significant dollar amounts associated with having negative text in your reputation profile. And these are numbers that you can, in fact, sort of make a meaningful sort of side-by-side comparison on. So wonderful experience is clearly a lot more important than A+++ seller. Okay, in terms of what dimensions matter more than others. We don't have a way of actually saying that this dimension matters more than that dimension because, in a sense, we would have to sort of equalize the modifiers then. And our theory is based on this conjecture that, we're not the first people to make this, but that sort of the value of a particular modifier depends on the dimension that it's modifying.
Question?
Yeah?
So those premiums were stated in terms of absolute price differences, not proportional price differences. If you take a look at the data in terms of proportion of the base price, does it fit better or worse? Have you examined that?
Well, we have controlled for the absolute product price, and yes, for products that have higher prices, have higher price premiums as well, and so higher prices associated. We haven't, and that's sort of an interesting suggestion, and that's something that I'll try, is to sort of look at price premium as in percentage terms, right? Okay, that I don't actually have that analysis, but it's something that is probably worth looking at.
Another comment.
Yeah.
Is it on your previous slide? Is it possible that the error margins on some of the modifiers are higher than the others? Probably have much more data on wonderful than you have on A++.
Actually, you'd be surprised how many people use this A+++. I mean, actually, even more popular is A+++++. And so, the 5 pluses, there seems to be something about that.
I'm not taking a particular example, but it's possible you have more data on some than on the others.
Yes.
Corresponding modifiers which are different.
Yes, it is possible. But if you go back to, so I mean, each of these sort of has occurred frequently enough so that when we actually are making the association, we're estimating our coefficients in this OLS, associating that dimension with a price premium. sort of the variance is low enough that it actually sort of shows up significant in the equation. So we're only looking at the 500 most frequently occurring dimension modifier pairs. And so, the ones that end up being sort of having a significant impact on price premiums tend to be the ones where, there is sort of a sufficiently frequent presence in our data. So, but you're right. I mean, there are potentially different ranges of error associated with these, and I wish I had the data on the actual sort of dollar error margins, but I don't. All right, so here are some other results that in my last 5 minutes I'll try to sort of go through. It struck us after we had completed this analysis that it would be nice to have a way of aggregating these dimension modifier pairs into sort of meaningful business sort of buckets. This corresponds to service. This corresponds to delivery. This corresponds to responsiveness. And we experimented with a bunch of sort of topic identification methods from text mining. And none of them worked in a satisfactory way. And this was actually an interesting process because through not being able to do this in an automated way, we realized that they're all based on a different model of generation of content. Because these topic clustering methods sort of assume that things are, say, two-dimension modifier pairs correspond to the same topic, are more likely to correspond to the same topic if they occur frequently together in the same documents. Now, that's not the case with this kind of user-generated content. If someone's mentioned delivery once, they're not going to mention a synonym of delivery, and so the sort of the basic generative model that would lead to efficient or sort of effective automated topic clustering has to change for this kind of thing, and that's something that we're working on. So we resorted to this semi-automated method, which is we hired 2 research assistants to cluster these things by hand. This is a familiar method. I'm sure many of you have used it in the past or sort of participated in such processes. And sort of broadly, we've got positive, neutral, and negative sentiments associated with a particular dimension modifier pair, and we put them into 8 buckets. We sort of went through the same process of trying to associate a particular, how valuable is having a particular score, and we sort of normalized everything, used these scores. And so we found significant variation in the relative importance of each of them, but I don't want to sort of, we're still refining this. I'm not completely satisfied with the way in which this has happened. I want to make it more automated, but this sort of is one of the challenges that we're dealing with right now. We also built a model to predict marketplace outcomes, a very simple one. All we did was we took each seller-competitor pair, treat that as a sort of one data point, and we trained a binary classifier, which is given this seller and given this competitor, which of the two will make the sale if they're both listed together? That was sort of the task. It was the simplest classification task that we could think of. We used, we tried naive Bayes, but that didn't work well. So we used a decision tree eventually. We didn't try sort of the more support vector machines or any of those more sophisticated things. Now, the model had virtually no predictive power when you took only price and product characteristics into account, which is, again, sort of not surprising. If you took the numerical measures of text and numerical measures of reputation, lifetime, and average rating and used them as features, it sort of substantially better sort of classification accuracy. If you took the structured text variables into account as well, there was 9 times out of 10 pretty much we were able to predict whether, given 2 competing sellers, which one's going to make the sale. And this is off a sort of 50-50 in the absence of this. We've done the usual sort of sanity checks on our opinion mining algorithm, the thing that actually structures these. Again, we sort of hired 2 research assistants to go through the process of manually identifying dimension modifier pairs, and the recall of our algorithm did not differ significantly from that of the human beings. And the final thing we did was this was based on the conjecture that suppose a seller has successfully conducted a transaction. I mean, I started by saying that sellers are different. They're heterogeneous in their ability to provide these different fulfillment characteristics. This sort of test goes one step further and says, well, given that a particular transaction has occurred, it's also more likely that the buyer who participated in this transaction values what that seller is good at. So, what we did was we identified what each seller is best at relative to, across all the fulfillment characteristics. And we tested to see whether being better at what you're good at relative to not what your competitors are good at, but relative to your competitors' scores on what you're good at, has additional explanatory power over and above, it just being a particular dimension. And in, all of the specifications, it was positive and significant. And so this is sort of evidence that, that supports the fact that, buyers are heterogeneous, but that's as far as we've gone. Okay, let me wrap up. What I've described to you today is, evidence that supports the conjecture that there is useful information in, the text associated with reputation profiles. I've described to you how you can automatically sort of score the sentiment associated with the text in, a reputation profile using an economic variable. And rather than sort of some preconceived notion of what the polarity of a particular word is. This idea that textual feedback matters and has an impact on the pricing power of a seller, we've sort of taken two different ways of validating it. We've sort of explained observed outcomes, and we've also built a predictive model and shown that its performance improves significantly when you take the text into account. So one might think of these as, if the theory is right, then you should have explanatory support and your predictive model should be better. And so both of these are consistent with the fact that this user-generated contact is in fact having an economic impact. It's also fun research. It's nice to sort of dabble. As I mentioned at the start of this talk, most of my prior work was sort of applied industrial organization economics theory in the context of information technology, pricing, network effects. And so dabbling with data can be fun, and so that is sort of a finding that I'm particularly happy to have gotten. And to go back where I started, I think this is important, and thinking about how do you quantify the value of information contained in textual content is important. It's a program of investigation that we're expanding to other contexts as well. Because users are generating content in these sort of business contexts in a way that we believe influences outcomes, and as our methods to actually sort of aggregate and mine this information become more and more sophisticated, it seems like there are lots of applications for how you might quantify this influence, and our particular study is one way of here's how you go about doing it. If you're interested in my research on other topics, this is my website. You can also Google me, of course. And thanks for your time. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.